Aha, I see the live button going. So, hey guys, this is the Story Embers webinar on character cliches. We're so glad to have you. Let's just make sure everything is working well technologically. Can you hear me? Give me a yes, thumbs up if you can hear me. If you can see me too. Let's see. I see Deus. Excellent. Everybody else, we're starting. Just make sure I can be seen and heard. Okay, so with me here today is Josiah DeGraff. He is the chairman of Story Embers. He also works for the Young Writer. He is a literature professor. Do you call yourself a professor?
Teacher. I don't teach
Teacher.
college, so.
Okay. Yes. He's a literary teacher at a classical school. And he also runs Ink Slinger Academy, where you can learn how to write better stories. And he's with us here today to talk about common character cliches, which can really turn off readers because they assume they already know how it's going to go. They feel like it's not a real person that they're reading about. So he's going to tell you how to look out for those, how to avoid it. It's going to be wonderful. So glad you're all here with us. And I think with that, Josiah, are we ready to get started?
I think so. So thanks for kicking this off, Deus, and welcome to all of you who are here to learn about common cliches in fiction that Christians write and how to avoid them. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, partially just because common cliches, character cliches in Christian fiction are just something I tend to talk about normally in my everyday life. I'm talking about different Christian books or movies I've read that I have opinions on. But the main reason why I'm really excited to talk about is because today we get to talk about not just the fact that character cliches exist and are bad. We can talk about how can you recognize these when they're showing up in your work so you can make sure that you are avoiding them, and how can you replace them with better, more realistic, authentic characters. So I'm really excited to get into this, and let's go ahead and jump right into this. So I'm going to go ahead and transition us here to our slides for this presentation as we talk about how to fix 6 common character cliches that exist in Christian fiction. Now, when I use the phrase Christian fiction, I feel like I need to define what I mean. Because if you went and polled, 5 different people on what the phrase Christian fiction meant, you would probably get 5 different answers on what qualifies something as Christian fiction, okay? So for the purposes of today, I'm defining Christian fiction as any story that's written by a Christian, whether it is, explicitly Christian or not, all right? So, as we look at these cliches, certainly some of these cliches might come up in what we'd call, an explicitly Christian book or film, one where, the characters are Christians, it's dealing with faith-based issues and stuff. But when I'm using the phrase Christian fiction, I'm talking more broadly than just fiction about faith-based issues. I'm talking about, any book that's, or, book that's written by a Christian. And so as Christians, when we go sit down and write, how can we make sure that we're avoiding common cliches that can sometimes pop up in the genre, all right? But before we get into talking about the 6 types of common character cliches I want to talk about today, I want to talk about the general problem before we get into specifics. And the general problem is, why do people write cliched characters, all right? So I actually want you to think about this question and to go ahead and put your answer in the chat box, all right, on why you think people write cliched characters. And the reason why I want to begin by thinking about this is because we're not going to best understand how to fix these types of characters if we don't understand why people write them in the first place, right? Because, contrary to, popular belief, quote unquote, most writers don't just sit up one day and say, oh, you know what I want to do today? I want to write a cliched character. That it doesn't work that way, right? That's not why people write cliched characters. There are very few people who intentionally sit down and say, I really want to write a cliched character, right? Most people want to write real characters. They don't want to go through the motions, and they don't want to write cliches, but somehow they end up writing them anyways, right? And so, if we want to understand how we can avoid doing the same thing, we want to understand, well, why do some people fall into this trap? To make sure that we don't fall into that trap as well. So I want you to put in the chat box, why you think people write cliched characters. All right, so you've got a couple answers coming in. One person says that that perhaps there are some types of cliches that people like. That's Veraza. You've got Christiana saying either because they're lazy or they don't know better. Emily says they don't understand real people or emotions very well. KM says, well, they're easier to write. It's harder to actually write a person who is a real person, not a copy of commonly written characters. So I think it's more of a lack of effort that creates cliched characters. Well said. Naya says they feel easier to write than fleshed out ones. So we've got a bunch of people also saying that's because it's easy. Hope says it's because they want a familiar, likable character. Honest Scribe says you don't want to offend readers. There's a bunch of actually really good answers here. I'm not going to take the time to read through all of them here, but definitely look through the chat box right now because there's a bunch of really good and meaningful answers to this question. All right, so there's certainly there's probably a dozen or so answers that we could give for why people write cliched characters, but there are four main ones that I want to focus on today. That we'll be focusing on as well in the 6 characters that we'll be looking at. All right. So the first question, the first reason why some people write cliched characters is, as people says, it comes from a lack of work and effort, right? One of the reasons why, people, including us, including myself, sometimes write cliched characters is that we simply haven't done enough character development, right? And if you don't put the hard work into developing your character to be realistic and unique and authentic, they're often going to remain at a cliched level. They're going to be underbaked. They're not going to be developed. As a result, they're going to be cliched. So certainly, I think cliches can simply come from a lack of effort. Another reason, though, why sometimes people write cliched characters is because they're just seeing what they've seen other writers do, right? A lot of us, we learn through imitation. We learn by seeing what do other people do well, and we ask ourselves, well, how can we do the same, right? And that sort of thing is good and normal and healthy, right? Everything we learn in life is in some ways often built on some aspect of imitation. But sometimes if we're not careful, imitation can simply become repetition. If we're just trying to copy what others do instead of looking at what they do and imitating it, but adding our own insights to it, all right? So sometimes I think the reason we write cliched characters is because we're trying to, whether consciously or subconsciously, imitate what other writers do without realizing that sometimes we're repeating cliches or we're repeating characters in a way that becomes cliched, right? The third reason why sometimes people write cliched characters, and this is more for the case for the beginning writer, is sometimes the beginning writer has a reverse problem, right? That they just haven't read enough in the genre to know the difference, or just not read enough in just in general to know the difference between what is a cliched character and what's an authentic character, right? That's one of the reasons why reading is important, because when we read as writers, we're learning that you're able to see all these different character types. The more we see the character types, the more familiar we should become about what sorts of characters are common, which are less common, to make sure that we're not, just writing cliches. All right, but the last reason I want to cover is one that I think is often specific for Christians like us, who want to write characters. And that last reason I think can sometimes, motivate us to write cliched characters is when we're trying to make a moral point, right? Sometimes what we're doing with characters is we've got multiple goals with our stories, and our goals aren't just to entertain readers, isn't just to imitate reality, but we also want to convey some kind of a message. And sometimes it might seem like, well, the only way I can actually convey a message here is by using a type of character that maybe it's cliched, but at least it's bringing about a moral point or a message, okay? So sometimes I think cliches come from the fact that writers are trying to bring across a message and believe that using a certain stock character type that can be cliched is the best way to do it. All right. Now, there's some people out there who say that this is a problem. Right? We shouldn't be making moral points in the stories. We shouldn't have messages. The solution to the problem of these types of cliched characters is simply not to make a moral point in the first place. All right. Some people say that, but I don't come from that viewpoint. And why don't I come from that viewpoint? I don't come from that viewpoint because I don't think it's a problem to try and deliver a message with a story. It certainly can be a problem if you're delivering it in a way that is preachy or trite or unnatural. But I don't think the problem, with this type of cliched characters is the moral point. The problem is that authors don't know the right way to make moral points. All right. And what I want to do today, as we're talking about cliched characters, is I want to do two things. All right. The first thing I want you to do is I want to help you better know when your characters are cliche. All right. We're going to be going through a lot of different cliches. And for each cliche, I'm going to give you a lot of different questions that you can ask yourself to determine if your characters are cliched or not. All right. So one of the things I hope you come out of this hour with is a better ability to diagnose and understand the difference between a character that is not cliched and a character that is cliched in your own writing. Okay. But the second thing I want to do is I want to inspire you to do more with characters. Okay. Because here is what I am not going to do. Okay. This webinar is not about beating up or bashing the reasons that people fall into cliches. All right. There are plenty of articles out there that are just talking about cliches and bashing them. All right. But that's not my goal here. All right. And I certainly don't want to bash the fact that some people want to tell a message because they don't think the message is a problem. All right. The problem is not that writers want to convey a message, but because often unhelpful stereotypes is the only way that writers know how to convey that message. All right. And that's why I want to inspire you to do more with characters. Because I think that if authors like you know the tells of cliched characters, you know when your characters are cliched, and you also see how many rich possibilities you have to be able to convey your message with more authentic, interesting, relatable, and natural characters who don't fall into cliches, that you'll be able to tell better stories. All right. So my goal is for you to emerge from this webinar being better informed about cliches, being inspired with authentic characters, and bursting with ideas to add to your story. That sound like a plan? Before we jump into our first cliche, though, I want to give you a basic rundown of the way that we'll be approaching each of these cliches. All right. So what I want to do in this time today is I want to walk you through a 4-step process for reaching past cliches, breaking cliches, and replacing them with more authentic characters. All right. And my goal is to take each of the 6 cliche types. We'll be going through these 4 steps so you understand what that looks like. All right. So what are we going to do with each of the 6 character cliches we're going to look at? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to understand how to recognize this cliche when it shows up in your writing, right? Sometimes cliches are something that we see in other people's work, but never understand in our own work, right? We like, sometimes pointing the finger at other people, but aren't always good at realizing when we're falling into that same trap ourselves, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define the cliche and understand how do I recognize this cliche when it's showing up in my story. All right. The second thing that we want to do is we want to understand why authors use these cliches. All right. Oftentimes, authors will have legitimate reasons for why they're choosing this cliche, right? And I want us to understand these motives because, while sometimes the motive can simply stem from a lack of work or laziness, a lot of the times authors write cliches actually with good motives and with good intentions, but not realizing that there are better ways to understand those motives and intentions. So I want us to understand why authors use these cliches, so that we're going to be able to understand how to avoid them when we understand their motive, okay? The third step we'll be taking is to then talk about why this cliche is problematic, okay? Some of these cliches will be rather obvious why this cliche is problematic. You'll say the cliche and you're like, oh yes, obviously this is problematic. But others will be less clear why it's problematic. So I want to briefly step through each cliche, why this cliche brings problems with it. Okay. And then the final thing that I want to do for each of these cliches is to help you understand what options you have to break these barriers of cliches down and craft more unique, authentic characters so that you come out with better ideas for how you can best achieve your motives and your goals with characters who are more interesting, more authentic, and more relatable. All right. So with that basic 4-step process down for how to reach past cliches, let's go ahead and get started with our first cliche of the day, the role model. All right. Now, what is the role model? Well, there are a lot of variations of this character type within stories that Christians write. All right. Sometimes it takes the form of the perfect Christian, right? Of that character who's in the story who's just an embodiment of what every Christian should look like. Sometimes, though, the role model takes the form of the perfect parent. All right, maybe it's the parent or the grandparent or some authority in the protagonist's life who's standing up as an example to the protagonist of what the protagonist should always strive to be like. But sometimes it can actually look like the reverse, and sometimes it takes the form of the innocent kid, right? Of the kid who is innocent, who's perfect, who has this maturity beyond his or her years, who whenever they speak are always dropping words of wisdom that all the other characters really ought to be following, all right? So the role model occurs when a character has no major flaws, has profound wisdom, and is being put on a pedestal to be an exemplar that all the characters and the readers should be like, okay? Now, how do you recognize this role model cliche when it is showing up in your story? Well, there's a couple, because, while we don't want to fall into a cliche of the role model, we certainly don't want to, shouldn't feel like we need to go to the opposite of, because some characters are too perfect, therefore, all of my characters have to be the devil, right? We're not saying that all characters need to be deplorable, awful human beings, right? There's a place for good, noble characters in our stories, right? But this is where it becomes hard for us as authors, right? Because it's easy to point the finger at someone else and say, yeah, this character is a bit too perfect, they're too much of a role model, it's cliched. But then when we look at our own writing, it can be a challenge to know, well, am I being cliched with this character? Or am I just portraying a good person, right? What's the difference between portraying a good character, a character who's morally good, and a character who falls into the stereotype or the cliche of just being the role model, okay? So there's a couple different questions that I think we can ask ourselves, in order to best distinguish a noble character from the role model cliche, all right? And just as a note, for those of you who are taking notes, there's going to be a lot of different diagnostic questions we're going to be going through in this webinar. And because there's so many, so that you aren't, frantically, having to scribble all these down in the notes, we have put together a PDF with lists of all these questions that we'll be giving out to all of you at the end of the webinar, all right? So you certainly can write them down in your notebooks. We'll also be giving those all to you, so you don't need to be, frantically scribbling throughout this whole thing, okay? So when you're trying to distinguish a noble character from the role model cliche, there's a couple questions we can ask to determine if we're falling into the cliche, all right? First question is, does this character primarily serve as a mouthpiece for my message, right? Is there is the character just in the story for me to be able to make it clear to my readers, what I'm trying to say in the story, right? If that's the case, then it might be a sign that it's more the role model cliche than simply a noble character. Another question to ask ourselves is, does this character lack any major flaws or sin habits, right? If our character doesn't have any problems, well, that's not terribly realistic. That's going to risk falling into the role model cliche. Another question that we can ask ourselves is this character being elevated in some way above everyone else, right? Because sometimes even flawed characters can fall into the role model cliche if their flaws are kind of just being brushed under the rug, right? If they're being brushed under the rug so that, yeah, the character does technically have some flaws, but they're just still largely being elevated in some way above all other characters as the character that all other characters should be following, right? If your character is doing that, it might be falling into the role model cliche. And the final diagnostic question we can ask ourselves is, does this character lack a clear personality apart from their innate goodness? Sometimes when sometimes when authors develop the role model character, they spend so much time focusing on how good the character is that the character doesn't really have a personality beyond that, right? So sometimes a diagnostic question we can ask ourselves is, does this character actually have a personality, or are they just good? Okay. And if you're asking yourself these questions for one of your questions in your story, and a number of these you're answering yes for, then you might have a problem. Okay. Sometimes a character, one of these might be true, but the character still works because of other things. But if you're saying yes to multiple of these questions, well, you want to be checking yourself, because you might have fallen into the role model cliche with this character. Okay. So if that's what the character is and how we recognize it, why do authors use the role model character type? Well, often the reason why authors use a role model character type is because they simply want to make their message clear, right? They want to make it clear that this is the way that people should be living. So I'm going to give the readers a role model for people to follow, right? It seems like a rather simple way to bring your message across to readers, all right? And sometimes it also comes not from a desire to preach, the message at readers, but simply because we want to give our readers, good people to root for, right? We don't want all of our characters to be dark, depressing, terrible human beings. We want some of those in our story, and we do want some characters who are very flawed, who are in need of redemption, who learn how to act better, right? Those sorts of characters are important, but oftentimes we want some noble, virtuous, good people in our stories, right? That's quite natural, right? There's a good motive here behind the problematic cliche. We want to give guidance to readers, and we want to give readers someone to root for, right? The problem with this cliche is that when we're painting a character who is perfect, right, it's unrealistic, right? Real people sometimes look like people who are just noble and virtuous and never have any major sin flaws, right? But you probably wouldn't think that same way if you lived with them, right? Oftentimes, the people that we might look up the most for being perfect, virtuous people, we can only say that because we know them at a distance, right? If you ask their family members, you might get a different picture. Not that the person has, is a terrible human being, but okay, they're human, right? And they have flaws as well as virtues, all right? And readers can tell this a mile away, right? When we're painting characters like this, right? And readers want to see real people, not simply puppets who stand in the way for the author, okay? So if that's how you can recognize this cliche when it shows up, those are some of the defined motives behind it, even if it's expressed problematically. If this is why this is problematic, well, what are the options then that you have? And how can we accomplish the same purposes without falling into this stereotype? I want to think about this by going through a thought experiment. The thought experiment I want to go through is, what tells a more powerful story? Is it a more powerful story to hear about a king who patiently waits to become the king and who then rules as an excellent king all his days? Or is it a more powerful story to learn about a king who patiently waited to become the king, became the king, but then started acting like the previous tyrant of the kingdom before he realizes that he's just as prone to power abuse as the previous king, and then works to overcome it? And which is a more powerful story? A story about a persecuted pastor who stays faithful no matter what? Or a pastor who's faithful in preaching the truth, gets thrown in jail, but then suddenly struggles with doubt in prison, wondering if he ever did the right thing in the first place, and only after a long struggle finally overcoming that doubt in order to die faithfully? Is it a more powerful story to hear about a deliverer who knows what he's doing to save his people, or a deliverer who didn't want to become the deliverer for his people, who doubts his potential all the time, is terrified of public speaking, and yet learns to overcome it all anyways in order to rescue his people? Hopefully, it's the latter of those three pairs that strike you all as the more interesting stories, because that's what God chose to write about in the stories of David, John the Baptist, and Moses, three of the greatest heroes in the scripture. One of the things that strikes me every time I read through the Old Testament is a lot of these characters that we often look up to as heroes did some pretty terrible things, right? If you take the story of David seriously, of this man who was king, who abused his authority in commanding Bathsheba to sleep with him, who then killed her husband to cover the whole thing up. If you just read through that story and you compare it to Saul, David doesn't really look like a hero. He looks like a pretty terrible person who would have gone down Saul's path if he hadn't repented. And yet there are still many aspects of David that we can still look up to as virtuous and heroic, because we don't need our characters to be perfect for them to be role models, right? I think that's a lesson that we can take from Scripture, that we can give certain characters, pretty significant sins and still present them as role models, as long as we're doing so carefully, as long as we understand what it looks like. Because ultimately, a role model doesn't mean someone needs to be perfect, right? It wasn't the case when God wrote, the Old Testament. It doesn't need to be the case for us either, right? And one of the quotes, and this is from an article that I read several years ago that stayed with me. It was from an article for the Gospel Coalition from a man named Andrew Barber, who's an English teacher at Stony Brook School. Right? He was kind of talking about the problems with Christian movies and being preachy. And he said this, talking about a few recent Christian movies at the time. He said, "What if Persecuted was about a pastor, formerly powerful in the Republican Party, coming to terms with his lessening influence? What if God's Not Dead was about a Christian wrestling with the fact that he knew atheists smarter and more ethical than himself? Suddenly we would have a chance to say something vulnerable, honest, and profound. But as long as Christian films are motivated by a desire to trap people into hearing a gospel presentation, or as a consolation for losing the culture war, they should not make the final cut." Right? And the point that Barber is making with these analogies is that sometimes the most interesting stories aren't the characters about the perfect role models, but it's about the people who become role models, not because they're already there, but because they learn how to do it over the course of the story. All right? And this is ultimately, I'd say, what we need our characters to need, or readers to need. We don't need to be telling readers that you can only be a role model if you're a perfect person, because by that standard, all of us are going to fall. What our readers need to know is that even though we have flaws, we can still become heroic role models if we learn to overcome those flaws just like our characters do. All right? So that's the first character stereotype of the role model. All right? Our second cliche for the day is the perfect lover. All right? Now, this character might seem like the role model, right? I mean, aren't I just talking about the role model again, with the perfect language, all right? But while this, the name of this character kind of sounds rather similar, it's actually rather different, because in the case of the perfect lover, the perfection of the perfect lover cliche is less to deliver a message or to set an example for others, and more to serve as the prize for a hero, okay? And this kind of is where a character falls into the trophy boyfriend or the trophy girlfriend trope, right? Where the character is showing up and they're perfect, just to show that they're, the best love interest for the protagonist, all right? And, obviously this is not a cliche that only shows up in Christian stories, right? I could name you tons of different secular stories I've read that also falls into this trope, right? So this, this cliche is not unique, to stories written by Christians. But stories written by Christians can certainly fall into this trope as well. Okay, so how do you know when you can recognize a character who's falling into the perfect lover stereotype and is just too perfect of a love interest? Well, there's a couple questions that we can ask ourselves. The first important question to ask ourselves is, does this character lack actual goals of her own? Does this character have actual personal goals, or are they just there, just to be nice and pretty, for the protagonist? Okay, there's a famous test that kind of came out, with regards to this in the 1970s. It's sometimes called the Bechdel test. All right, because oftentimes the perfect lover stereotype more happens to female characters than to male characters. All right, and the Bechdel test, it originated, from some different, from some different literary critics who kind of applied this test to story. And what is the test? Well, the test is, in the story, do you ever have two female characters who are talking in the story about something that is not, about a man, or something, or not about a boyfriend or a husband or something else? Okay, sometimes this comes up in what is called feminist literary theories. I know that feminism comes with its own it comes with its whole slew of hot button fiery political debates with it, right? But if you ignore all those to the side, I think this sort of question is an important one, because it's just to ask you a simple question here of, do these characters have goals and have conversations about something other than the love interest? All right, and you'd be surprised by how many stories fail to meet this test. All right, but that's one of the questions to ask ourselves if we're trying to determine if our story falls into the perfect lover stereotype: is, does the character lack actual goals of their own? Another question that we should be asking is, does the character always get along with the hero, right? Most romantic relationships that I know about, aren't just peachy without any fights the whole time. There's going to be fights sometimes, but that doesn't always show up in fiction, right? So if we want to be realistic, we want to be asking ourselves, does my character's love interest always get along with them? Another question to ask is, does a character have a life outside the protagonist, or do they lack a life outside the protagonist, right? If all the love interest is ever doing is completely tied to the protagonist's life, well, they're not going to seem as realistic, right? Because in real life, there's more to someone, than the person that they're dating or they're married to, right? There's a lot of different facets, and we want to see that. All right, and the final question to ask ourselves as we try to diagnose if a character's fall into the stereotype is, does the character ever take meaningful actions in the story, right? Because if the character never takes meaningful actions in the story, it may be falling into this stereotype, all right? And if you look at these questions, and if any of these questions that are on the screen you're saying yes to, that, yeah, my character, the love interest really does fall into this, well, then you probably are falling into this problem, okay? Now, why do authors use the perfect lover cliche in the first place? Well, sometimes it simply comes out of a lack of effort. It comes from laziness of, putting this character in the story but not developing it. And sometimes, though, it can also stem from a too strong of a desire to show that this character is perfect for the hero, okay? So sometimes it's out of laziness, but sometimes just out of a misguided desire that, I want my hero to have a really good romantic relationship, therefore I'm going to craft this perfect person for them, all right? Now, why is this perfect lover character problematic? Well, the reason that this character is problematic is because it often doesn't fully recognize the character's whole humanity, right? It's unrealistic. As a result, it often makes the character nothing more than wish fulfillment for the protagonist, right? And wish fulfillment isn't very helpful, right? Whether it happens in real life or whether it happens in fiction, right? And not only is this, a lazy approach, but doesn't show readers how to work with real people and real desires in a romantic relationship. So what other stories could you tell with these characters? Well, perhaps it's a story about a protagonist who thinks that he's with the perfect lover, quote unquote, who realizes that the person he thought was the perfect love interest doesn't fit his exact match qualifications. Instead, he needs to work through a relationship with someone who doesn't fit his exact mold because no one does. Perhaps it's a story about two different characters who love each other but want different things and thus need to learn to fit together. Perhaps it's one where the characters have different goals and dreams, and thus they don't just, they aren't just trying to, be there for the other person because they have their own goals as well that they're each trying to balance between them. All right. And these all create more interesting stories because when you give the love interest their own lives, they'll not only ring more true for their audience, for the audience's characters, if you can show us that this love interest has a life outside the protagonist, but it'll also give the reader more interesting conflicts and plots to think about with regards to the story's theme, all right? So that's the love interest, all right? So let's move on then to the third cliche, which is the peacemaker, all right? Now, unlike the other cliches we've covered so far, this character is a bit different, all right? Because unlike the others, the peacemaker always comes as a group of characters who fall into this, all right? So the peacemaker becomes a problem when you have multiple characters who never experience any meaningful relational conflicts, all right? A lot of the time, in Christian fiction, this can take the form of, the group of Christians who always get along together in, brotherly and sisterly unity and never have any fights. But certainly, this can happen even if the characters aren't Christians, whenever you have a group of major characters who never really experience meaningful conflicts, okay? So here's how you can tell if you're falling into this cliche, all right? You might fall into this cliche if your character's goals never differ at all, right? If all of your main characters all want the same thing, or all on the same quests for the exact same reasons, and don't have any differences with what they're trying to achieve throughout the story, okay? If your character's goals don't differ at all, well, they might be falling into this peacemaker cliche. Right? They also might fall into this cliche if they never get upset with each other, right? If you're thinking about two major characters and you realize, these characters never get upset with each other in any way throughout the story, well, you might be falling into this trap. Or if they do get upset with each other, but they always quickly apologize or forgive each other, they might also fall into this trap if they never have to take some time in order to fully apologize to someone or forgive someone else. Okay. And so, this can certainly be a group of 5 individuals who fall into this. It can also just be 2 friends who fall into this, right? And so what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, for any pair or group of major characters in the story, do they ever, fall into one of these traps, right? And if their goals never, and if you either answering no to the first question on the board, or if you're answering no for both of the second 2 questions, you're probably falling into this trap. Now, sometimes you can get away with this if characters never get tangibly upset with each other, but they have to work really hard not to be upset with someone, right? So if they have to struggle, and I mean, actual struggle, not just a one line, I don't feel like this, but I'm just going to quickly, do the right thing anyways, right? If they have to meaningfully, slowly struggle in order to do the right thing, that's different, right? But if they're always easily getting along with each other, on the same goals, never getting upset with each other, well, you might be falling into this trap, okay? Now, why might authors use the peacemaker cliche? Well, again, I think oftentimes authors have a noble motive in mind, right? And often, particularly when it's Christians who are doing this, often it can come from a noble motive of an author saying, well, I really want to show the unity of the church, right? Because the Bible says that the church should be unified and that we should be loving each other and doing kind things. They say, well, I want to give my readers an example of what the church ought to be look like. I want to give them role models to follow. All right. And when I say that, you probably realize, how this is, already falling prone to many of the same issues with the role model, cliche. But that's one of the reasons why authors will do this. But sometimes this isn't an author's motive. Sometimes you might say, well, I just want to do this because these people are allies, right? If you're allies with someone, of course you'd want the same things, and you won't get into fights because you're all trying to pursue the same end together. Okay. And so sometimes it's, just the fact that you're writing a story and you want all of your protagonists, your main characters, to get along, all right? And sometimes this is simply done in ignorance. But those are some of the reasons, why, authors might use the peacemaker cliche, okay? But why is this problematic? Well, the reason that this sort of thing is problematic is simply because it's unrealistic, right? People get into fights all the time, including Christians, especially when in close quarters. Right? If you, lived with, the godliest Christian family you knew, you probably realized pretty quickly, oh yeah, these people, have fights and don't always get along with each other, just like everyone does. Right? And so part of the reason why this is problematic is because it's unrealistic. It's that they have false expectations for readers. And it's also boring, right? Because it means that there's less conflict in the story. And a story is always more interesting. And well, generally, you could probably find an exception, but generally speaking, stories are more interesting the more conflict they have, right? So this cliche not only makes a story more unrealistic, if the main characters never have meaningful disagreements with each other, but also makes the story more boring, right? And so as a result, as we're trying to break through and break past this cliche, we don't want to shy away from relational conflict. A relational conflict is more interesting, makes a story more engaging and more to the point, especially, when we're thinking of, especially for those who think, well, don't we have an obligation to show the unity of the church? The question that I would ask is, which better conveys the gospel message? Is the gospel message better conveyed when, people who are saved automatically always do the right thing and get along with each other? Or is the gospel message better portrayed when we see characters who are struggling to work together? They don't want to work together, and yet slowly over the course of the story, they learn to get along together anyways. I'd suggest that latter end isn't just a better story option because it makes the story more interesting, but also because it better portrays the gospel message, and that we don't automatically do the right thing. We don't automatically get along with each other. We can learn to get along with each other, through fights and hard work and patience. The danger of the peacemaker approach is not only does the story become less realistic, but we risk telling our audience a lie. The lie that we will automatically help each other as Christians instead of acknowledging that, yes, we're flawed. And yes, we don't always get along with each other, and we don't always want to help with each other. But even flawed people can learn how to get along with each other. And so our reader has that opportunity and that promise as well. All right, and that's the peacemaker. Moving on to our fourth cliche. Our fourth cliche is the white guy. All right. And what is the white guy cliche? Well, just like the peacemaker cliche, the white guy cliche isn't one that comes individually. It's one that comes in a group. All right. And the white guy cliche happens when you have a group of characters and you realize that pretty much everyone in the story, is white, and there isn't much racial diversity, right? Where the racial diversity that does exist is stereotype, is the token minority technique, or something else. All right. And so, as a result, I don't think we need to talk much about how to recognize it, since it's pretty easy to recognize. All right. Now, when I say this, and I put this as a cliche, I don't want you to hear the wrong thing. Okay. I don't want you to hear me saying that all stories that only have white protagonists are cliched, or that you should never have a story that has all white protagonists, or something else. Okay. It can be perfectly fine for a story. If all the characters are of the same ethnicity, especially if you're setting it in a time and a place where there isn't much diversity. Okay, so this is unlike the others. This isn't always automatically wrong. All right. The problem, however, comes when most stories are falling into this, right? Because one of the things that I notice when I look across Christian fiction is that sometimes even if individual stories by themselves might not have this problem. Right? If all the stories you ever write are just featuring, people of the same ethnicity, well, you might want to ask yourself, well, am I leaving something, am I leaving something on the table? And am I missing opportunities to tell more engaging, interesting stories? Not that this is necessarily a problem, but that's only one small sector or spectrum of reality. And there are many other, ethnicities and races that are interesting to explore through the lives of our characters. Okay. So, that's how we can recognize this cliche. And like I said, just because you're all the characters in your story, are of the same ethnicity doesn't necessarily mean it's cliched. That more comes when, you add a bunch of stories together and notice a pattern. All right. In terms of, why do authors use this cliche? Well, I think a lot of the time, this is one of the major ones where I don't think people, often intentionally fall into this, at least not if this is a cliche, right? Oftentimes this is something that people unintentionally fall into, because sometimes you just automatically make all of our characters of the same ethnicity without really thinking about, would it be realistic to have other ethnicities in this setting, them developing as full-fledged characters or not? All right, so oftentimes this is simply stems from a lack of thinking about it as opposed to intentionality. All right. But let's get to let's get to the big button one. Why is the white guy cliche problematic? All right, like I said, it is not necessarily bad to make all of your characters in the story white. Especially if there's it's a specific setting or time and place where that would be most realistic. All right, but the goal that I want us to think about with this cliche is that as authors, our stories will always be better when we're making decisions intentionally as opposed to unintentionally, right? We always want to be intentional as authors. We don't want to be unintentional, right? And sometimes the reason that stories fall into this, isn't because is because we just, are being unintentional. Our character creation aren't thinking about, well, are there other options for us, right? And I know that when I'm talking about something like this, this is something that's, it can be a bit politically controversial and become a very heated debate in literary circles, right? And I want to, for this topic, I want to avoid all the fire debates we could have about how diversity in fiction is used here. Certainly there are good ways to use diversity and there are bad ways to use diversity. All right. I don't want to get into the political side of that debate. All right. But I think one of the reason why I brought this up is because at its core, what we do when we're thinking about the ethnicities of our characters is this gives us an opportunity to think about our options, right? If we're only always writing about characters of one ethnicity, well, we're going to have limited options, right? And if we say, well, no, I'm going to write a lot of diverse characters from different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different cultures who are each going to come at the issue with different viewpoints, well, suddenly we have a lot more options. We have a lot more potential for creativity. Not only does this give us more options, does this free us as storytellers to be able to explore character types we might not have thought of otherwise if we weren't thinking about this. But diversity is often more realistic, right? Not in every culture, time, and place, depending on when you're writing. But for a lot, but a lot of the time, diversity brings more realisticness to it. As a result, it makes the story more authentic and more interesting. not only this, but, if we look at the book of Revelations, Revelation says that heaven will be full of people from every tribe, tongue, and people and nation. And so as Christian storytellers, we have the opportunity to be able to portray the breadth of God's creation, right? So I don't want you to think about this cliche of, we just need to make sure we're, scoring enough, political correctness points or anything else for that. That's not what I'm saying. I don't really care about political correctness on that front. So this isn't a matter of scoring political correctness points, a matter of depicting God's complete handiwork. It can be completely fine to write a story where everyone is, of the same ethnicity, if that's the best fit for the story, especially if it's in a time and place where that's most realistic. But oftentimes, I think we'll find that not only does including diversity make the story more realistic, because in most times and places there's a lot more diversity than we realize, but also makes the story a lot more interesting, as we have the opportunity to explore, real people from different cultures and different background experiences than our own. All right. And so what kind of stories can we be telling? We can be telling stories with characters from other cultures and life experiences that add other layers of depth to our novel. We can tell ones that are different from the ones that we might be used to in new and good and interesting ways, right? We don't need to be roped in by just using characters from one race because we haven't thought enough, we aren't consciously thinking about, are there ways to include a natural and realistic diversity in the story, right? And certainly if you're ever depicting someone of a culture that is, or time and place that's not true, you want to make sure you do your research, do them well. But when we think about diverse ways to explore characters, I think we'll often find that there's a lot more options that are interesting and engaging and powerful than we might have realized that we had otherwise. All right. Our fifth character cliche for today is the cancer patient. All right. And if you have seen enough Christian films or read enough Christian books, you probably already know what kind of character I'm talking about here, right? This character occurs whenever someone has a sudden illness or a life-threatening condition that suddenly in the middle of the story threatens their life and introduces stakes to the plot, right? It's the sort of thing where when you see it, when a character suddenly in the middle of the story, gets hit with some kind of life-threatening condition, okay? Now, why will authors sometimes include this cliche? Well, oftentimes authors will include this to build more conflict and drama into the story, right? Because if a character you care about is suddenly dying, well, suddenly the stakes of the story are upped, right? There's additional drama, there's additional conflict, and it can also serve thematic purposes. If an author wants to show, God's ability to heal people, or, the endurance that Christians can have through suffering, okay? The problem, however, with this cliche is that it's pretty overdone and it can sometimes be rather extreme, okay? Just like, with the white guy cliche, I think sometimes, authors will fall into this, because they haven't thought about what other options they have, right? Sometimes as authors will think, well, there needs to be more stakes, there needs to be more conflict. I know we're going to threaten someone's life, okay? And, sometimes, that can be the appropriate move, right? It's certainly not always a problem to include a life-threatening illness to a character that suddenly appears in the middle of the story, right? But sometimes if we aren't being intentional about it as the author, because intentionality, I think, is a common thread between these cliche and the former one. The common thread is that it's a rather easy approach, and that sometimes the easy approach to building dramatic tension isn't always the best, right? We want to look for opportunities to challenge ourselves as storytellers and think about, well, I could create additional tension by throwing a life-threatening condition here. But maybe I could also build tension through some other way, that maybe isn't threatening someone's life, but is still meaningful and raises the stakes in engaging ways, right? It's not that we never want to use, the cancer patient, or the character who suddenly has a life-threatening condition, right? But we want to be intentional to know that, is this always going to be the best option, right? It's an option, but is it the best option for the story, all right? And so before we give a character a random illness in the middle of the story or have them suffer some random actions, you want to consider, what are your other options? How can you raise the stakes and have people learn about the difficulty of trust and working through some difficult experience and other less extreme circumstances? Certainly extreme conditions can sometimes be appropriate, but less extreme circumstances can also be a good fit for the story. And so we want to think about, what are all of our options, that we're using an option not just because it's the first thing that comes to mind, but because we're being intentional about it, all right? Our final cliche for today is the unbeliever, right? It's the unbeliever, all right? And the unbeliever is not necessarily cliched, right? We can certainly have interesting non-cliched unbelievers in our stories, But, I think many of you know what kind of characters I'm talking about, when I'm talking about the unbeliever cliche in Christian stories, all right? And oftentimes this type of, unbeliever, there's, two types you often get of this cliche, right? We can sometimes get one vision of the unbeliever as being, basically Satan, right? These are the unbelievers in stories who are just, terrible, horrible human beings, no redeeming qualities, right? They're just, going straight the other way, doing all the wrong things, right? There's that's sometimes the type of unbeliever that we get, right? But there's another type we get that goes all the way to the other extreme, right? What I'm calling the almost date-worthy unbeliever, right? The unbeliever who, is really almost a Christian, so the protagonist can justify getting into a relationship with them, and who will eventually have some big conversion moment and become a Christian over the course of the story because they're almost there. Okay. Now, unlike the last two, this one though is going to take more work, right? Because we don't want to say that every unbeliever in a story who's pretty depraved is automatically cliched, right? And we don't want to say that every unbeliever who's almost a Christian is automatically cliched, right? Because those sorts of people exist. There's a lot of in-between area as well. But those people exist, right? So the question is, well, how do we know if are the unbeliever in our story is cliched, all right? And the question that I would encourage yourself to ask here is to ask yourself, with this character who's not a believer, is this character more important in the story because of what he believes or because of who he is, right? Because we always want our characters to be people first, right? And if as you look at your story, you realize that, hey, this unbeliever is really more important to the story because of what he believes and because of who he is, we might be falling into the stereotype. And you might need to do some additional work in order to develop this character to have more of a robust, fascinating personality, okay? Oftentimes, the reasons why authors use the unbeliever cliche is to show the truth or the power of the gospel, which is, an understandable motivation to have. But the problem is that when that is being used at the expense of character, well, it's not going to ring true for readers. It gets repetitive with how often it happens across Christian fiction. And I don't think it's being honest, in our depictions of what the world is like. Because if you think about the unbelievers, a few of them fall into the stereotypes or the cliches that we sometimes see in Christian fiction. All right. And the truth is that we've got a lot of opportunities and a lot of other ideas for how we write the unbelievers in our stories. Perhaps, if we want the unbeliever, to be influencing the protagonist in the bad direction, perhaps we could paint that more in a more complex light by having an unbeliever who by Christian standards is a bad influence, but actually has a compelling reason for the protagonist to change by their worldview and truly cares, about the believer that they're trying to influence in ways as Christians we might not believe are right, right? There are many unbelievers that I know, try to persuade me to do different things I believed are wrong, but not because they were, basically Satan or just, out there to destroy me, but because they honestly, by their worldview, believed, that would be better for me. Now, I did not happen to agree with them, but people can encourage people to do immoral things for, rather sympathetic reasons, even if they aren't completely right. Another option is as we're thinking about what other options can we tell with stories, is to tell stories about the unbeliever who has a legitimate respect for Christianity, but has a real strong rational opposition to the faith, right? There's room there for characters who aren't basically Satan, right? Who have legitimate respect for Christianity, but yet they're not, just a step away from being Christian because they understand our belief system, but have different reasons why they disagree with it, right or wrong as those reasons are. All right. And there are many other types of unbelievers that we can write about as well. All right. And so what we need to write in our stories is we ought to be thinking when we're writing the unbeliever of, do they have a unique personality? And am I portraying them with respect and with empathy, just like I'm doing with all of our other characters, right? Because I think, as Christians, when we're called to love one another, it doesn't only mean, it doesn't only mean, we need to, love, all the people, in the real world. But we also want to think about when we're writing characters in our stories, are we treating the characters who disagree with us with respect and empathy as well? Not just because that character is close to believing the right thing, but just because I'm portraying that character as a person. Characters automatic and people automatically deserve, respect and empathy. All right. And we need to have empathy for the unbeliever character in our story that isn't just because they're almost a Christian, but because they're a person. And often this is going to form better thematic questions for us as stories and create more powerful messages. How do we interact with unbelievers who are more complex and varied than what's sometimes portrayed on the page? Having believing characters interact with unbelieving characters, be challenged by them, and realize, well, maybe how to, and learning how to work with unbelievers who might be more empathetic, even more virtuous than them. It creates a strong possibility for powerful, authentic Christian storytelling. All right. So at this point, we've covered our 6 cliches, and hopefully by this point, I've helped achieve this goal of helping you better know when your characters are more cliched and also inspiring you to do more with characters. All right. So Deus, who's running this chat, will hopefully about this time be putting a link in the chat box, in the chat, to where you can find a document to download the different diagnostic questions for each of those 6 different character types, so that you can look at the different characters in your story and ask yourself, is this character falling into this cliche or not? All right. And Deus, if you're listening to this, that's in the chat box, the private chat box between the two of us. So you should be able to find it there. All right. And so, hopefully, this webinar, especially when you get this, will be able to help you to do both of those things. One of the common themes that certainly come up, though, in this webinar is that as we're talking about how do we avoid cliched characters, a large part of that is developing characters that are more realistic, right? I've talked a lot about crafting characters who are more realistic and more authentic, right? And the challenge, though, is that in some ways, realistic characters are hard to develop, right? It's easier to say, right, realistic characters than to actually do it. Right? I've certainly given different tips about that front, but there's a lot more about realistic characters than can be tackled in a 1-hour webinar session, right? So how else, besides this time today, can you deepen your understanding of this? All right. So we're going to be moving pretty soon to a Q&A where I want to answer what, Deus and I will answer any questions you have about, overcoming these different cliched characters and developing stronger stories. Before we move on to that live Q&A, though, I want to share about another opportunity that we have created to help people, Christian authors particularly, with the task of creating more realistic, authentic characters. All right. What I want to talk about is the Authentic Character Summit that we're going to be running at the end of this month. All right. Now, some of you, if you've been following us for a while, have already seen us posting about this and already know about the Authentic Character Summit and what it is. All right. What the Authentic Character Summit is it is a virtual summit that we're running at the end of the month, specifically on the topic of developing authentic characters, which is often the key for avoiding cliches. All right. Now, in case you're looking at this and like, well, what is a virtual summit? I'm not familiar with this term. Well, a virtual summit is similar in some ways to a writer's conference, all right? And that you'll have a bunch of different skilled authors who are coming together to speak and teach about a writing topic, all right? But a virtual summit is different from a writer's conference for a couple reasons. One is obviously that it is virtual. It's online. It doesn't require you to travel. It's not, it's play on the computer, right? It's something you can attend from the comfort of your living room, right? It's not something you travel to. It is a virtual summit, a virtual conference. All right. The second thing, though, that makes a virtual summit different is that as opposed to a writer's conference, where often the sessions are on a bunch of different topics, this virtual summit is on a very narrow, focused, specific topic, right? Every session that is at this summit is going to be about how to craft authentic characters and looking at the different angles, right? Because one of our goals with this summit is we didn't want to just give you a cursory understanding of how to develop realistic characters, because characters shouldn't be shallow, and so we didn't want our summit to be shallow either. All right. Our goal is to give you an in-depth introduction, in-depth understanding of this topic, which means trying to focusing every single session that's at the summit about this topic. All right. So you can learn meaningfully from each of the speakers who explore the topic from different angles. Okay. So who are the different speakers who will be speaking at the summit? Well, our 2 keynote speakers for the Authentic Character Summit are Tosca Lee, who is a multi-award winning New York Times bestselling author of over 11 novels that you might have heard of. She's written a number of really good works of Christian fiction. And our other keynote speaker is Alan Arnold, who is the founding publisher of Thomas Nelson Fiction, and also the author of a book called The Story of With, which is a book for Christian storytellers that a number of authors have found to be transformative and influential in their journeys. All right, these two authors will be kicking off and closing off the summit. And we'll be beginning and ending the summit with advice on giving us a vision for what authentic characters look like. Between their opening and their closing talks, we also have a number of different session speakers who will be looking at this topic specifically from some different angles and talk about specific aspects of what it means, to develop authentic characters. All right, we've got a bunch of different authors that you can see on the screen who will be speaking. Authors like Paul Renier, Janine Ippolito, Sarah Sundin, Brandolyn Collins, Kara Swanson, Rolina Hatfield, and also both Deus and myself will also be speaking at the summit and talking about how to craft authentic characters. All right. And how will we be looking at this topic? How are we breaking it down? Well, we're breaking it down into 3 different themes for each of the days. All right. The first day we'll be just talking about, well, how do you develop realistic characters on a personal level? How do you give them realistic personalities? So we're going to be talking about how do you portray the full human experience in your fiction? How do you develop a unique voice for your character that rings true and sounds authentic? How do you write characters from other times and cultures? And how do you, craft characters not only as a plotter but also as a pantser? Because sometimes pantsers get the short end of the stick when it comes to writing discussions. And on the second day of the summit, we'll be talking about how do you develop realistic characters on a relational level. And once you build a strong personal level, how do you extend that to the relational level? We talk about how to pull off romantic relationships, how to pull off non-romantic relationships, and also about developing one of the most important relationships in the story, which is the relationship between the protagonist and the reader. All right. And then finally, once we look at characters relationally, we're going to be looking at characters morally and talk about how do you use foil characters to tie the story's theme into the characters. How do you depict really immoral characters without offending readers, which can be a rather tricky topic to tackle. And how do you show the whole process of a character changing over the course of the story, all right? And if you go to the link that's below the video, you'll be able to see the full details of each of the sessions we'll be speaking on, so you can see the different angles that are trying to approach this complicated topic. I know one of the important questions when you're considering, well, what conferences do I go to, what summits or courses do I buy, to be able to grow as a writer is, how much does it cost? All right. So I've put up on the screen the 2 different ways that you can attend the conference. All right. Most physical writing conferences that you'll attend to will cost probably somewhere over $500 when you add in registration, hotel costs, travel expenses, etc. All right. Thankfully, because this is done virtually, we don't have all the costs that physical conferences have. All right. So we can deliver these speakers and sessions to you for only $75. For those of you who are interested in coming, or only $25 more to get permanent access to the sessions. All right. So that's that registration comes with being able to access all the sessions either just during the summit or permanently afterward, depending on which option you choose. In addition, to joining a Facebook group, so you can get some sort of community discussion, about these different sessions and get some of that experience of the summit, as well as other live events like writing sprints and character challenges we'll be doing during the summit to help you apply what you've learned and to be able to achieve this mountain peak experience as an author that sometimes comes from a really good, writing conference or summit. All right. And as a special bonus for all of you for attending the webinar live, we're throwing in a special bonus that for anyone who signs up before midnight tonight, we're also throwing in a free mini course that I've created on how to break cliches with your summit registration. All right, so if you want to continue to think about and learn about the different things I was talking about today about how to take additional steps to break cliches in your stories, if you sign up before midnight tonight, you'll get that free mini course along with your summit registration. All right. You can do that either by clicking the link at the bottom of the page or by going directly to storyembers.org/summit. All right. Because here's the deal. When God created humans in his image, he wasn't, what was he creating? He was creating sagas. He's creating these complex individuals that could walk and talk with him. And nothing in creation beats human complexity. And as hopefully I've shown today, nothing is more powerful than human complexities in our stories as well. Yet, as authors, we often have a hard time understanding our own hearts, let alone those of our uncooperative characters. And so that's why at the summit, we're bringing together some award-winning authors, speakers, and writing teachers in order to teach you the greatest art of all in writing, which is depicting the human soul. You can write characters so real that they leap off the page, and you can present characters in all their beauty and depravity so that readers leave with a clear sense of what it means to be human. All you need is to learn the right skills to accomplish the task. And for any of you who are interested in the summit, you can go to the link to learn more about the summit and how can it help you better craft authentic characters.
All right. You done, Josiah?
I am done.
Excellent. That was great. It was classically you. I know you love to talk about character cliches all the time, so I was really looking forward to this. And I was thinking about in my own story, there was one of those cliches I almost fell for. It was so close, and probably I'm gonna have to keep watching out for. So I'm gonna have to really go think about this afterwards.
I hear you. I mean, when I was putting this together, put this together a couple weeks ago, there's one of the times I was going through the diagnostic questions. I was thinking about one of the minor characters in one of my stories. I was thinking that character actually might fall into this. I should go double check on that and make sure I'm practicing what I'm preaching here.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, thank you, Josiah. Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're now going to start the Q&A session. First of all, I'm just going to repost that PDF so nobody misses it. Go download that and use it to analyze your story, because you can easily go away from this and think, oh, that was great, and then forget to apply it because, as we've said, we've just noticed, oh, wow, we know about these cliches, but we miss them. And they can slip in very, very sneakily. And I don't know if sneakily is a word, but it is now. We hope to see you all too at the Authentic Characters Summit. There's like 12 sessions. Each of them is basically like almost a full-length course, like a small full-length course. And I know I've been putting a lot of work into my talk, so it'll be a fantastic time. Love the speaker lineup we have. So we're opening up Q&A session now. Please go ahead and submit your questions. We'll be glad to answer them. And to start off, we have, I think, 3 questions already. And so, Josiah, our first question is about the role model cliche. So does the role model cliche apply to God or a God figure?
Short answer is no, because God should be perfect. And if you're putting flaws in God, well, there's going to be other theological issues that we're going to have. The slightly longer answer, though, that I do mention in this, I think particularly comes with allegory, in that I don't think it's fair to apply the role model cliche to God, because God is not a human. He's God, he's perfect, and he should be treated differently. But I do think that sometimes as Christian authors, we should be careful about how we are using God. In that I think it can become easy to use God just as an easy way to get our characters out of things, or just to give advice, where we just have our the God figure or God in the stories just telling the characters what to do, and the characters just automatically doing it. But again, that's less a problem with writing God into your story, and more of an issue with how characters respond to God, right? Because if you look at the Bible, we don't see an example of God says something, everyone automatically does it. That is not the story of the Old Testament. So I would not apply the role model, cliche to God, but would say that we should be careful when we're depicting God in our stories, not only to make sure that we're not misrepresenting God, but also to make sure we're not misrepresenting how humans respond to God. Because we don't always obey God like we ought to, or listen to him like we ought to. And we do want to be careful of, even, turning, God into a mouthpiece for all of our views in the story.
And we had 2 questions actually about the Authentic Characters Summit. So the first one is it possible for a group of friends to split the cost and purchase the summit together?
So the summit needs to be purchased individually. Certainly, we do have a discount for family members, though. So if we're talking about multiple family members in the same family, you can do one ticket for the family. If it's if it's a group of people, though, those do need to be individual for the different ticket costs.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought. And then also with Facebook or with the summit, I believe we're running like groups on Facebook. So if someone is not on Facebook, will they have to create an account?
Yeah, so you do not need to create a Facebook account to be able to attend the summit. All the videos and the sessions and even the live chats during the sessions, those will all be on the website. So to access the sessions, you don't need to create a Facebook account. The Facebook account is more if you want to be able to discuss the sessions after the sessions with other people and be able to form more connections with other writers. In that case, you would need to create a Facebook account for the community component, but you can still get access to the sessions. And also, participate in the live chats without having a Facebook account, just like you are right now.
Right. And I think they could still read the discussions on Facebook, just not participate.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Actually probably not, because it's not going to be a public group. So you would be able to see those discussions. You would need to create a Facebook account.
Okay. Yep. And if you don't like Facebook, you can just create an account and then delete it later. Let's see here. So our next question is, what if I only have a brief scene with a role model character, so I don't have room to emphasize that he does have faults and struggles? How can I portray him as the very good person he is, but not fall into a cliche?
Well, that's certainly a difficult question. I'll be curious as to hear if you have any other insights for this as well. My response would be is I do think it's a bit different if they're only showing up for one scene. What I would focus on there is I'd focus on a couple things. First, I'd make sure that they have a real personality that comes out in the scene. It might be a bit more of a two-dimensional personality, because you can't bring out a three-dimensional personality in just one scene. But would make sure that they have a personality, so they're not just the wise sage spouting advice. They have personality and character as well. And that would be the main thing that I would focus on doing. The other thing I'd focus on doing, though, is just look at the character's reaction for whichever character is going to advice from it. If you can show us that in the eyes of this character, the person they're talking to is a real person. Even if we as readers don't get to see on the page that they're a real person, knowing that in the character's mind they're a real person with flaws and everything else also can be enough to overcome that. Des, I don't know if you have any other, it's a good question. Did you have any other thoughts or advice on that?
I 100% agree with what you said. The only thing I'd add is if you're writing from that character's viewpoint, make sure you really focus on what that character wants, what their goal is in the scene. So they're not just, oh, someone's come to me, I'll give them advice, the end. But there's something that really matters to them. Like maybe they're really worried about the character, or this gives them a sense of like relief to tell this story because they've been holding it in for a long time, something like that. So hopefully that's helped whoever asked that. And then I like this question. What are some cliches I should look for in a brother-sister dynamic?
Ooh. Brother-sister dynamic.
Which is probably not too cliche because it's a little rare, actually. But
that's actually what I was going to say is, part of the cliche is just they're not present, okay? And, coming as someone who has 8 younger, brothers and sisters and who grew up with all of them, I love a good sibling relationship. I'd love to see more of them. So I'd say that largely it's just a matter of, let's, portray them in the first place is important. But the other thing, that I'd also, say is, if, for anyone who has a sibling will know that sibling relationships are very complicated. You've got a lot of shared history with each other. You've got a lot of pet peeves with each other. You have a lot of things you like about each other, and, there's just a lot of complexity in a good sibling relationship, and so there's not any, apart from, siblings who always get along or siblings who always hate each other. I would just say, apart from those obvious cliches, there aren't as many, cliches I think of, as opposed to just the importance of, make sure you have a rich, complex relationship with the history, as all good sibling relationships will have.
Mm-hmm. And
Yes, I know you have a lot of siblings yourself. Are there any other tips you would give for people who want to write siblings without being cliched?
I guess I would just say that there can be a cliche of them basically doing nothing but bickering, which can happen if the family is really torn apart. But I'd say, especially throughout history, with families having to work together, living together without transportation and iPhones and everything to separate them, you're probably going to have more to the relationship than just bickering, though that will be there sometimes. And our wonderful next question is, I can't think of any obvious flaws with Dumbledore or Gandalf. What's your opinion on why they don't come across as cliche?
Let me think about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Really glad we got that one.
I am glad too. So there's a couple things that spring to my mind. I'll tackle Dumbledore first. So I'd actually argue that Dumbledore has rather significant flaw in that he is a teacher who puts all of these burdens and responsibilities of stopping evil on his students. And this is just my personal opinion as a teacher. As a teacher, I look at Dumbledore as like, okay, I understand what you're doing for the plot. I understand that for the plot to work, the characters need to do something. But as an actual teacher, you should probably be calling in more adults for some of these things than shoving all of this on the kids. Now I don't know if Rowling intended that or not. But I do think you can see some shirkings of responsibility in Dumbledore in that sense. It's also been a while since I read the Harry Potter book, so my memory of Dumbledore is a bit fuzzy. With regards to Gandalf, who is a great character, and I think this is a really good, rich question, because it is hard to find flaws in Gandalf. I think there are a couple things though that keep Gandalf from falling into this. One is the fact that Gandalf has a very clear personality, and that he's not just the wise sage giving advice. Like, he is definitely a personality, who is a unique character and doesn't just feel like someone dispensing wisdom. I also argue that, and maybe I'm thinking, I think both in the films and the books that sometimes come out, is that Gandalf has a bit of a temper, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Pippin is doing stupid things, Gandalf isn't the person to come alongside Pippin and say, "Now, Pippin, let's think more carefully about this," and caringly guide Pippin. Right? He's like, "No, you fool of a took! What the heck are you doing?" Right? So I think Gandalf does have a temper that also makes him come alive as a personality, not as the perfect sage. So those are the two things that came to my mind. Des, I don't know if there's anything else that came to you for Gandalf on what keeps him from falling into that cliche.
Yeah, I'm just going to pull from my talk, give the Cliff Notes version, that I think what makes Gandalf unique here is that he's not a passive character, that he's really the mover and shaker, and that although he doesn't have much of a character arc, he's the cause for a lot of character arcs and change. Okay. Now, let's see. So someone wants to know how one would write a realistic conversion to Christianity.
So what's the question?
So how you would write a realistic conversion to Christianity.
Oh, it kind of deserves its own talk.
It does.
My Spark Notes advice would be that a conversion should be structured like a character arc. Okay, and a good character arc does not happen over the course of one moment, but it happens over the course of the whole story, where you very slowly see them rejecting their old experiment in living and living by a new experiment in living. Okay, so part of it I'd say is that a good conversion arc should be very gradual. I also say it's very important to make it be natural to the character. Different people have conversions in different ways, and a lot of them are very tied to who the person is. Right, so I'd also say that should be very tied into who the person is, not something generic, right? And looking at real life conversion stories can certainly be an inspiration of that. I do think that one great challenge that even with those is going to be, I'm just going to say this as a challenge to overcome, is that one challenge is going to be that, part of the problems that can come with conversion arcs if it feels like it's just preaching to the reader, right? Where the unbeliever says, well, this conversion arc is just because the author wants to convert me. Mm-hmm. And I don't have any simple advice to give on that other than to say that it's hard, and I'd recommend looking at examples. Okay, so for me, one of the most powerful conversion scenes in the book that I've read is in Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I actually don't really like the book as a whole. It's a bit long-winded, even for my taste. I actually think the movie is better. I know there's probably some of you want to burn me at the stake for that, but I'll take that. But regardless of the book as a whole, the conversion scene I think is fantastic. And the reason why it's fantastic is because both in the book and in the movie/musical, you really get a sense for who he is and why he would take this. And he just the interior life of the character is portrayed very powerfully. So that's portrayed in a way that's very authentic, very real, and even happens over a very short period of time. The whole story is about the conversion arc, but it doesn't feel like it's being preached at the reader either. So, I would recommend studying, Jean Valjean's arc in Les Miserables is a great example of what a good conversion story looks like.
Do you like the one in Crime and Punishment too?
Oh, Crime and Punishment is also great. I thought you might take that one, so you didn't mention it.
Thank you. That's what I was thinking of. I can't really pick apart Crime and Punishment into molecular detail, but I guess one thing about that is that, like just I said, the whole book had kind of been building up to it. Not so much in that he had been moving that direction, but it was like setting the groundwork and discussing the themes that were important to that turning point. And then I think a lot of it really has to do with what I guess would call the surreal, like a sense of God being at work, that there's a miracle here, that it's not just a rational decision. It has to feel like a conversion. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah.
Let's see if we got any other questions. So guys, we're on to our last question here. So if you have any more questions, shoot us up, but we'll go ahead.
Actually, I see, and this is coming from our streaming thing. We've got one comment through YouTube as opposed to through Chatango. If you want to, do you see the one from Bibliophile?
I don't think I'm not on YouTube.
I can actually read it because I see it. So this is a comment coming in through YouTube Live directly itself. Mm-hmm. Is Bibliophile asks, does the cancer patient cliche apply to characters whom the author kills? All right. So is it still cliched if the character dies? Mm-hmm. So for that, I would say it depends. Certainly it's not a problem to kill characters. I kill a lot of characters in my stories. But it can be cliched, and if it's, because sometimes it can be used like the cancer, patient cliche. So, if you have a character who just, out of the blue dies for no good reason, just to motivate the other characters, that can be done well, but also can become cliched if it's done, too much. Right, we don't want too many times for the only time the characters are motivated is through the sudden death, because again the drama and the conflict that comes from that is easy, and it's not necessarily bad to go for easy conflict and easy drama, easy loss, but sometimes it can feel cheap if it's overused because it's easy. So I would simply say, with regards to killing off a character to bring additional conflict and drama, is that I just think through, is it the best option for the story? Many of the times it will be. It's good to kill off the character. That's the right move for the story. But sometimes you might realize, well, actually, I could actually bring across a very similar effect without killing the character, right? And so if you can do the same things without killing a character, I would strongly consider not killing off the character, because you don't want to avoid the risk of just feeling like you're just taking using cheap tactics. Sometimes there's a very effective tactic, is the right tactic. But just like, the cancer patient, I posed the same question here as I did for the cancer patient. It can be the appropriate choice. Just think through it. Think through if there are any other ways to do it so you can make sure that it is the best approach if you're going to use it.
And we have two questions now. First question is, how would you suggest writing a Christian who has a good working personal relationship with God without making it seem cliched?
Well, in some ways, I'd say that there's a lot of different ways that can be portrayed, right? Because as I think about the virtuous godly Christians that I know, I know a lot of people have strong relationships with God, which all look very different. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so in some ways, I'd say, just look around you at people and I'd say look at people people well, right? Because Christians that but don't know too well. You want to make sure you know them well enough to know kind of the other side of them that might not be as public facing. Because sometimes as Christians we know how to put on the right face at the right times. All right. So I'd say my first recommendation would be to think about people think about what their relationship looks like and how those relationships differ and portray that. A couple other things I'd say is even strong Christians will struggle a lot. Being a strong Christian doesn't mean you're not going to have doubts. That's one of the reasons why I brought up, John the Baptist at one point, and why, because I find John the Baptist to be a very, fascinating person, right? Here's somebody who's kind of like a firebrand, right? In the right when Jesus is coming, who is hated by everyone else, but boldly preaching the gospel. Who, when Jesus comes, and no one thinks anyone of Jesus, he knows who Jesus is. He knows Jesus is the Son of God, and he baptizes him, and he sees the Holy Spirit himself descending like a dove. All right, if you want evidence that Jesus is the Son of God, he saw it. He's been there. But what does he say when he's in prison? Well, he sends messengers to Jesus. He says, "Are you actually the Messiah? Because now that I'm in prison, I've lost everything. I'm not so sure." Right.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus does not say, "Oh, John, the worst doubting Christian that's out there." No, he says to his disciples, of those born of women, it's hard to find someone better than John, right? John
Mm-hmm.
still presented as a very faithful Christian, but yet he has a very real struggle of, I just doubt, and I don't know if he's really the Christ or not, right? And I think sometimes we can have the mistake of thinking, well, if someone is a strong Christian, they're never going to have doubts. They're never going to have meaningful struggles or anything else. And I think John shows us that, as we're portraying Christians, they can be strong Christians and also wrestle a lot with some really serious doubts or sins, because that's what we see all over the Old and New Testament.
Do you have any books too that you think would display this well?
Well, not to spend this whole time marketing other things, but we are doing a virtual book club right now at Story Embers about the process of Jesse Woods. Now, a lot of the characters in there are not particularly strong Christians, but I do think you have a couple strong Christians in there who are portrayed very well for their struggles. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So The Promise of Jesse Woods by Chris Faber would be one book. And if you get the book, you can join our virtual book study, join our discussions by going to storyembers.org/book club. I think there's a dash in the middle between book and club, or you can check our recent emails to find something about that. All right. Or our social media pages where all have stuff. So that'd be one book. Another book that I'd say does a good job of just portraying the struggle, of a Christian would be, and this is it's technically a play, but it would be A Man for All Seasons, a play about, I believe I always get Thomas More and Thomas Becket confused. I think it's Thomas More, all right, but he's someone who stood up for what he believed, did not marry Henry VIII. When Henry VIII wanted to marry one of his 6 wives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a good story about, and this, and the character is very heroic, noble character. But over the course of the play, he too will struggle with doubts and with doubts over the course of it. So I would look to, that would be the other one that comes to my mind as well.
If I could add one thing too, the book I thought of is probably no surprise to you, Cry the Beloved Country, which isn't exactly a case of a guy who has like a perfect relationship. He definitely has struggles and is not like the ideal. What's the cliche you brought up? The role model.
Mm-hmm.
He's not exactly a role model, though. He's a very kind, definitely Christian man. He's a pastor. But the thing I got out of that book was that his Christian life was not really about following a procedure. It was not about struggling. and there was struggles, but it wasn't about the struggle. That's not how he viewed his Christian life. But it was about grace in his life, and the story was full of struggle over circumstances, but then the relationships involve the grace of God being poured out in areas he didn't expect it to come. And I think of like his son was having a court trial, and there was a guy who offered to do the court trial. There's like a Latin term for it that means for God, basically for God's sake, for free. And that was a really moving part, that one short line. I think the guy cried at that. And that was an instance of a really moving scene of someone having an obvious close relationship with God there. It's because of the feeling of grace involved. Okay, so we're done.
That's an example.
Yeah, so we're down now to our last question. It
All
says,
right.
I have one character that is a very sweet, kind person that handles a lot of bad things that happen to him the right way, not vengeful, etc. The biggest flaw I can think of in him is his fear. He has PTSD and sometimes freezes up in the midst of danger because of it. Is this a flaw that would work as his main flaw?
I would be hesitant to put PTSD down as a flaw because of the fact that it's not something that he can control, right? So it's certainly a struggle that he has. It's something that's deeply personal, right? But people, it's not a sin habit. It doesn't stem at all from sin. It stems from suffering, what someone's experienced. So I wouldn't call that a flaw. My recommendation in this situation would be, even if the character, is able to learn how to do the right thing, showing the flaw could simply come from showing the character struggling at times to do the right thing, right? If the character, there's a difference between a character who, regularly does the right thing. It's just, like snap of the finger. Oh yeah, these people are treating me horribly. I'll just, automatically treat them kindly. And the character who treats people kindly, but it really hurts for them to do it. They really have to work and think about it and pray and struggle a lot in order to do the right thing. I think that those are two very different characters. And the second does not necessarily fall into the role model cliche. It can, but doesn't necessarily. So, if there aren't any, other flaws that spring to my mind, I would try at the very least to show a strong struggle there, and, not a cheap struggle, but a meaningful struggle. So that even if they do the right thing, we say, well, it's not that they're automatically a good person, but they have to work at it. It takes time for them to do the right thing.
I guess that could even be a flaw of viewing their PTSD as like an excuse for not acting. Of over self-pity.
Sure. Yeah, the challenge of PTSD could lead them into other things, things as well. Knowing how do I cope with this thing that I can't control in the right way.
Okay, so it looks like we have come to the end of our questions. Wow, we had a great turnout. I think Josiah said it's like 140 people. Is that right?
Well, those are the people that signed up. I wasn't paying attention during this and how many people were here. I think we had a good 40 to 50 people or so.
Yeah, that is a really good turnout. And if you missed it, we'll be sending out a replay if you missed part of it. Again, don't miss the PDF. Let me go ahead and paste that in here one more time. And I'll also, after that, go ahead and paste in the link to our Authentic Character Summit, and I assume we'll be sending a link to that out in the email coming.
Yep.
So Josiah, thank you so much for putting all that work into the presentation, for helping us realize the cliches we might be using and how to overcome those. So guys, go out and apply this. Don't just let it be in one ear and out the other. And we hope to see you at the Authentic Character Summit, where there will be so much more.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming out, guys, and thanks for being a great co-host, Deus.
My pleasure.